really what I wanted to talk about is this idea of self-relation. And to me, self-relation versus communion, this is really the essence of really the whole debate, because I think that if you actually look at Western philosophy, the problem has always been an inability to conceive of communion. It's been focusing on self-relation and privileging self-relation over communion. This is what Pavel Florensky says in Pillar and Ground of Truth, where he critiques the law of self-identity. And his whole point is that within the law of within this logic of identity, I mean, this logic is the logic of rationality, and it's our fallen rationality. It's a rationality that is incapable of conceiving of communion. And that's why the two essential dogmas of the church, the incarnation and the Trinity, these are two revelations of being itself, which is communion. The Trinity is the highest idea ever conceived by man. There's no other idea that it is as sublime and I think just intuitively true once you really get down to it, that the one and the many are not in any sort of disharmony. And but when you think in terms of self-relation, you ultimately negate being. And I do not see it as any coincidence that currently, right now, the culmination of the German idealist project has ultimately led to Zizek, whose subject isn't anything like the Kantian subject. It isn't like even Hegel's subject, which has all of this, the content of consciousness, which it can sublate into absolute knowing. The Zizekian subject is a void of self-relating negativity. There is no better definition of hell than that. So I don't see it as a coincidence that this attempt to think in terms of self-relation, and even more significantly, to conceive of the center of philosophy as man himself. I mean, it's when we move from God, we turn to man. This is pride. This is what you would expect, given if Christianity was true. The apostasy from God led to us centering our philosophy in the subject, conceiving this subject as an autonomous self-relation. And what is the logical conclusion of that? It is the abyss of this self-relation, completely devoid of all communal relations, and that is Zizek's subject and Lacan's subject as well. This split being that you can't even put a signifier to it. You can't name it. It has no definition. It always stands behind the world as this void. And I mean, uh, you can comment on that, but one thing I want to mention as well is I think what this ultimately leads to is the problem of immanence and the impossibility of metalanguage. Because from an immanent perspective, right, when you're conceiving of reality as this close totality of your own representation, there is no way to make this totality consistent. This is something Jonathan Pajot talks about in relation to the logic of 666. 666 is this closed totality that, in being this closed totality, it expels otherness, it expels the seventh, it negates God, pushes God out, so that it can be this closed totality. But the reality is, any immanent, any notion of immanence leads to incompleteness, because in order to totalize something that's complete, there has to be that seventh, that element outside of the totality itself, the what I would call the gaze of God, which totalizes the system as a consistent whole. But from within the system itself, you can't perform that totalization. This is what Kurt Gödel talks about with his incompleteness theorems. So there is this problem of meta language, and maybe we could turn to talk about that a bit, because Lacan says that from within language, within the symbolic order, there is an internal division, and there is a split at the core of the symbolic order, and there is no ability to step outside of it. We're always already caught up within language. And I think what you were saying about the captivity, this sort of impasse that we have with the fall, the fact that we're always already thinking in terms of the fall, right? We're already in the fall. So the question is, how do we get out of it? Christianity provides a solution. But I don't see it as any coincidence that for Lacan, who doesn't have the notions of the Trinity and the Incarnation, he doesn't have an ability to think of a meta language, of something outside of the symbolic order.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot to say there. It's interesting. Lacan talks about science. He says science sutures the subject, right? It made me think of this inability to see oneself, as to posit oneself as the scientist objectively looking at the world, conducting experiments to realize the truth. That process sutures the subject. It actually sutures the human being out of the system, right? And I could see that, this is a result, and I think the imaginary plays a big role here in terms of how that works. But again, when we talked about kind of the origins of this understanding of the ego, and it has something to do with this reification of rationalization. And Lacan would say that any attempts when we say that the kingdom is the real, these guys are just applying what they call the kingdom to cover over the real, and they're investing it. Small object A has really got a hold of them, and Das Ding, this idea that they've come across that raises the thing to the raises the object to the dignity of a thing, raises this idea of the kingdom in Orthodox theology as the thing that will cover over the real. And you're always trapped not knowing whether or not you are doing so, right? So if someone that's coming from the outside is going to say, you're just doing the same thing Lacan was critiquing by cover overing the real through new linguistic formations and master signifiers to make you feel comfortable, in this sense. So he would say kind of repeating, doing the same thing. Quote here, Lacan says, or quote here says, as Lacan explained, Christianity, in particular the Roman Catholic he grew up with, is adept at providing meaning, in the sense that meaning serves a purpose of rationalization, which keeps the unconscious at bay. Everything's rooted again back to the unconscious and keeping the unconscious at bay. The unconscious is where the real erupts, right? So how do we parse this? How can we understand this system, right? This orthodox theological and practical system as not just another instantiation of covering over the real? And I think you hit it right on the head. And it has to do with this distinction between autonomous, individualistic existence versus relational, communal existence. And it's in that communal juxtaposition in the world between self and neighbor rather than self and other that heals the rift at the kernel of subjectivity from a Lacanian perspective.